You should see the meeting is now streaming online on YouTube. Give it just a couple seconds to start, and then you should see okay. The meeting is now streaming. So we're good to go. I'll let you begin, Dr. Dixon, and we're all set.
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to the Frederick Douglass Institute at Edinburgh University. I Can't Breathe. We're excited to highlight some research opportunities and initiatives that are going on as part of the larger Frederick Douglass Collaborative and Apache system. With me this evening is Dr. Rhonda Matthews, who is going to talk a lot about her research project, and Jacqueline Smith, who is also a research assistant to Dr. Matthews, but a graduate student in the counseling program. And then we're also joined by Harrison Dixon, who is also facilitating a project, Read Me My Rights. And he's going to talk a lot about what that program and that project, that research project is. And we're hoping to have some discussion today around the issues with policing, law enforcement, and what the implications are on our communities as a result of some of the dynamics that have occurred over not just the past year, but certainly in previous years, but got highlighted in the midst of a tridemic. So thank you all for joining me this evening and being part of this critical conversation. I'm going to let you all talk a little bit about yourselves and the work that you're doing and the projects that you're working on. Dr. Matthews, we'll start with you, and Jacqueline, if you guys would share the work you're working on, the project you're working on, and just tell us a little bit about yourselves as well.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Dixon. So we are working with the Frederick Douglass Institute on a project, primarily on a project called I Fear for My Life. And what it really is, what its primary purpose is to collect stories and reporting and data on some of the incidents of police brutality and police killings of unarmed Black civilians. So in our case, we are looking at what happened to Michael Brown and what happened to George Floyd. So the reason that we're doing it, and well, let me back up. We are part of a broader collective. The end result of all this is to be a publication, right? That drills down on the information about each one of these instances, as well as the other instances that other teams of people are examining. So, and one of the reasons for that is that what Dr. Watson is trying to do with this publication is give people an opportunity to learn what some of the patterns of behaviors are that have brought us to this point. And part of it is for, education. We want to know what the patterns are. But the second part of that is that so we can address and change them and through whatever means we have at our disposal, through policy, through education, through any one of a number of, kind of structured institutions in our society. So what we're doing is collecting data, gathering evidence, so we can review the patterns of behavior that we are seeing, just in these two instances, but really to get to a point where we're looking at it writ large. So I'm a political sociologist. My primary education is in sociology. One of my specialty areas is politics. So when we look at this, when I look at it especially, that's the lens through which I view not just the murder of George Floyd, not just the murder of Michael Brown, but also the broader pattern of murders of unarmed civilians by police officers. So when I look at this stuff, when I'm examining it, what I want to know is, okay, so what are the cultural issues that are at play? right? That's the first thing. What's in the culture out here that prompts this kind of behavior? And then after you examine things from the cultural perspective, then you've got to figure out, okay, well then what policy and law does that lead to? Because you don't just get policy and you don't just get law from, from the ether, right? There's usually some cultural reason that we construct the policy and law that we do. And then that informs behaviors. So then there's an examination of behaviors, right? When we construct policy and law, people act or do not act accordingly. So part of what we're doing here is gathering all this data so that we can understand it better, so that we can make structural change, so that the culture becomes a different place. So that our society becomes a different place as a result of it.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Matthews. I appreciate that overview and the work you're doing. Jacqueline, we'll give you an opportunity to share a little bit about yourself and what role you're playing in this research initiative.
Sure. So my name's Jacqueline. I'm primarily a graduate student in the counseling department. And this opportunity came across my email, and I kind of looked at it and my heart jumped at it. My brain was like, wait a second, this is something that's really meaningful. It is research, but it's a heavy topic. So I kind of had to give it a little bit of thought. But my role right now is I'm looking at a bunch of different articles. And my particular individual is George Floyd. The other assistant who's in our group, she's looking at Michael Brown. And what I found most interesting, I think, at the beginning of this was that there were explicit sort of directions as far as like, well, we don't just want the New York Times. We don't just want that information. And I thought that was really important. I'm looking at photographs. I'm looking at sort of where were those photographs taken. Things that stand out to me are that there were demonstrations for George Floyd in, South Korea, and that stood out. So looking at articles even that have poems that are reflective of what took place. And so my role is really looking at all these different pieces of information that came out of George Floyd's murder and identifying where they are in the whole big picture of things. Looking at, well, does this speak to the Black Lives Matter movement? And if so, how does it mention other individuals who were victims of police brutality? How relevant is this to the whole project? And so it's kind of taking a magnifying glass and looking at all the articles and deciding whether or not, or at least putting on a spreadsheet and deciding whether or not how they might fit into this if they do. What I found to be kind of disturbing almost is the fact that there are several very similar narratives regarding any of these police brutality cases. And you really kind of have to do your research and be responsible consumer of these articles to kind of know who's writing them, why are they writing them? Because as a whole, if we want to figure out how to address these things, we're going to have lots of different perspectives about like what's happening, what is the problem, and to get people on board who are reluctant to be on board, we kind of have to know their perspective too. So one of the challenges for me is kind of reading an article that I don't particularly like, that I think it's coming from a different angle, but still understanding that that's a relevant perspective that should be included in this project. I think it's also interesting that the other student in our group, she has a background that is social work and also law enforcement, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that it is really just kind of fascinating to kind of think of, well, how is she reading these things? And so what I appreciate about the project is that you have all these different people from different backgrounds looking at all of these different types of articles and filtering through in whatever framework we have to become part of this bigger project. But that's primarily how I've been interpreting it and what I've been doing.
Jacqueline, thank you. We're going to certainly come back to you. There's some questions I think that the project you all are working on, I want to talk about and how it really relates to the work just as FDI in general and our initiative around social justice. So thank you. I appreciate your feedback. We're going to shift gears a little bit and greet Harrison Dixon. Harrison is working on another initiative at EU that's part of the larger PASHE initiative around for the Frederick Douglass Collaborative. Harrison, if you would just share a little bit about yourself and then talk about the initiative that you're working on.
All right, thank you. Again, my name is Harrison Dixon. I am a adult ed student at Edinburgh University, junior third year, with secondary ed is my focus, concentration with history. I have spent several years, I have a military background as well as law enforcement on a city and state level. So when I came to this FDI program, I guess it was very unique. It was a great opportunity for me to give insight and be able to really connect from a personal level from both sides of the fence. Because there's a lot of stigmas with law enforcement, with police officers, and also obviously Black Americans. Being that I fit into both of those categories, I've had very unique experiences, both positive and negative, with both components in life. So I really wanted to have an opportunity to share that with students in discussing, what is the relationship that we really have as, say, law enforcement when you have this, overall umbrella saying we're here to protect and serve, but then yet you see so many contradicting stories in the media, that really poses a serious threat on the integrity of what we are to believe in and how we are going to carry on in society to kind of create a bridge to what has been so just utterly destroyed. So I'm really excited about the opportunity of being a presenter. One of the things, my main focus in my first presentation will be called free-ish, because as a Black individual in America, yes, we are free, but are we? So I really want to cause some really critical thinking behind that notion. To really understand what was happening from the time of Reconstruction in American history, leading forward into the 13th Amendment and so on and so forth. Because there were so many different things that have caused society to react and be where we are today right now. And it really stems from, obviously, the beginnings. So I'm really excited about that opportunity, that and even the correlation of overseer to that word transforming into officer, because that's a very real stigma. And there are some facts and some fiction that go with that. So I'm really looking forward to being able to dive into those conversations with everyone, and I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Harrison. While we have you here, just you talked about your first program focusing on this construct around free-ish and some of the things that have happened in our history and how they relate to law enforcement. Can you tell us a little bit about how you're going to, go about organizing that and what we can expect to participate in that, when we can expect to see some information on that program coming forth, and how it will be hosted so that others can tune in?
Well, yes, I have a few meetings coming up actually in this coming week with the FDI group. Excuse me a second, I was losing you on my earbud. But yes, I have a meeting coming up this coming week as far as my schedule time, as far as when I can formally put together a schedule to house the town hall meeting. That's basically how we're going to be doing this. But as far as the delivery, really, it's going to be a series of questions that I'm going to pose, and a lot of them are going to be tough questions. I guess about myself personally, sometimes I'm perceived to be a little bit of abrasive, but not in a negative sense. It's just I am very just as a matter of fact. So the questions that I pose will be very hard truths that we should, again, address and confront. I feel that that's the only real way that, as they say, the age-old statement, the truth shall set you free. I can't be apologetic for the information that comes across, but, we have to be cognizant and be willing to have these types of conversations that are uncomfortable for white America, Black America, and all points in between. Because until we're really willing to have that honesty, we're going to be, inundated with these facades and putting potholes over these holes that obviously need to get repaired, just like PennDOT's out every year trying to fix these potholes. It's the same, these are social potholes that we have. So Free-ish is going to give us an opportunity to really open up and let our honest feelings come out. And then we're going to be able to dissect what is true, what is not true, because the media, I'm a firm believer that they are so responsible for the division of society and the maintaining of division. We've even seen that going way back into the 1600s. So there's some history stuff. Bacon's Revolution. The idea was the elites wanted to make sure that Blacks, well, poor whites, Blacks, and Indians stayed divided, because they almost had an opportunity to overtake the whole situation and stand up for themselves. At one point they lost, so then it was like, hey, we can never let this happen again. So then poor whites were given a little bit more just because they kind of were still white. Blacks were divided off because they were the slaves, and Indians were given alcohol and other things to keep them seduced and inundated with a clouded perception of what was going on, similar to the Opium Wars in China. But again, I'm digressing. But the point is, we've got to be able to open up and have these conversations. So I'm looking forward to really having those hard Q&As with people.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think, Dr. Rhonda can attest that we've had some pretty challenging conversations in the FDI over the past year or so. And, that's the way we're going to get to understanding and presenting issues. Sometimes we may not agree with it. We may not see it in the same way, and we may not have experienced it in the same manner, but being able to come to the table and dialogue about it and try to at least have folks understand or have some dialogue about it. Whether or not I leave with an understanding that is your understanding is a different dynamic. So, one of the things I guess I was just thinking of as I was listening to all of you talk is that, we had this dynamic that's going on with, shootings in America. I mean, certainly we're focused on the killings with African Americans and even Latinos and communities that seem to be underrepresented, and that there seems to be this shift around that population versus other populations in terms of law enforcement and policing. But one of the questions I guess I really want to ask is, what's the implications when there may be police or law enforcement presence in school systems, predominantly when there are, communities of color? And I'm just kind of reflecting, pulling a little bit from Dr. Rhonda Matthews' comments, but also Harrison, yours, when you use this kind of construct, overseer, as the enforcer in law enforcement, what's the narrative that often may be left in young Black and Brown youth minds when there is law enforcement present in schools? Anybody?
Okay, well, so when we talk about, I think before we even talk about police presence in schools, I think we have to wind it back a bit and talk about the over policing of Black and brown populations, period, like across the board. It is a statistical fact that people in Black, brown, and poor neighborhoods are policed much more often than people are in middle and upper class neighborhoods. That's part and parcel of the culture and that history of policing that Mr. Dixon just talked about. So I think we have to think about that first. Now, here's the other thing: when you look at the statistics in terms of crime, there's also a discrepancy there. So one of the reasons that we see higher statistics in poor Black and brown communities is because they are more highly policed, right? Those are the numbers that we hear about the most because that's where the police are by and large. But when you look at the statistics of crimes that are committed, even if they aren't policed, one of the things we see is that there's a fairly high crime rate in middle and upper class neighborhoods as well. It's just that those people aren't being, aren't being arrested and, perp walked, to and from police stations as often as we see people who are poor and or, people of disenfranchised communities. So I think we have to start there, right? Because there's a broader cultural behavior that is occurring, right? That's already there. It seems to me that as a method of social control, that the next logical step would be to put police in poor Black and brown high schools, right? If the purpose already is to control, right, which has been the system ever since, right? It is to put the toughest strictures that you possibly can on the people who are considered to be the least desirable in a population. Then the next thing to do is make sure that you get those strictures, those methods of social control into every institution within those communities. Putting police in high schools is just the next step. And what is again most interesting about this, and I'm not saying that crime does not occur in schools, it does, but it occurs in all high schools, right? All of them. But it is the poor communities, once again, that get policed the most. And here's the message. We already have a school to prison pipeline. We already do. When you put a police precinct or a large police presence in the school, that it is designed, it is focused upon the school, then you leave no doubt as to what it is that you're trying to do. The school to prison pipeline is no longer a pipeline. The school is the prison. And so, we have to talk about all kinds of, social and cultural and psychological effects that has on people. What does it do to your psyche to walk into a place that you're supposed to be learning in and have a police present, an armed police presence, and they're there just to police you? How can that be good for anybody's state of learning? I mean, it can't be. And so I think that that's an important. Thing that's happening in our culture. It's an important social interaction that I don't think we pay enough attention to. I really don't. I mean, and the extension of that. I know I keep talking, but I keep thinking about stuff as I keep talking. But I think the extension of that is some of those behaviors that we see. The people in Texas. The family that the police had in a Walmart parking lot, in the blazing hot sun, mother and her children, all children handcuffed on, face front on the, I mean, come on, right? Handcuffing 9-year-olds, pepper spraying 9-year-old. I mean, there is something that is not, those are not isolated incidents. They are part and parcel of a pattern of behavior. And we have to address that. We have to. If we want to be a healthy society in any way, we have to address that.
Right. And sometimes I'm so appreciative of how you frame that, because I think the narrative comes, back with, this is about safety. This is about protection. And so, protection for who and who,
Right.
And of what. And certainly, as a counseling lens and a psychologist lens, again, it is very much that, like, what is the narrative that young people take away from that? What does that mean to them when they see that? What is it speaking to who they are? And, a lot of the work that we see coming out of this year, particularly on the human service side, is really starting to dig into the trauma, the implications of historical trauma, particularly in Black and Brown communities, and what that has done, to one's image, one's psyche, one's sense of self-worth, and then you compare that to the larger political realm, when you have someone in leadership saying, I could walk down the street and shoot somebody and nothing would happen to me. So
and have it be right. And
Right.
that he's correct about that.
Oh, I
He's
know.
not right.
Mm-hmm.
In all of these things, it's so, when you mention just school in general, when I'm reading these articles, when I go online and read any of this, my program, I'm in the school counseling track. And I always think, well, what would I do if I were in that setting, if I were in the school, in Minneapolis, like what would I be doing? How would I be doing that? How would I work with the student to convince them that they're okay, or to work with them, knowing that they're in a setting in the school where they're probably not okay? How would I as a counselor both confront and address the very real and harsh reality of over-policing in schools, while simultaneously trying to help them work through that self-concept and a worldview that isn't going to be, problematic for them in the longer run. And it's disheartening, but it's the fact that in some cases, like you said, Dr. Matthews, the school is the prison. And it's just an interesting place to be in, to know that at some point in time I will graduate and be a school counselor, and to have that be the reality. It's the lens that I look at these things is like mental health, of course. How do you empower someone if they are not yet in a place where they can maybe even fully grasp that concept? So there's a lot of different things. I think that policing in schools is just, there's so many aspects when it comes to even social issues in general. Like, are we looking at this from the policing end? Are we looking at this from a racism aspect? Are we looking at it psychologically? How are we approaching it? So it can be overwhelming, but I think it's definitely a worthy topic of discussion. I'm remembering working with a student who was in a teacher education program, and she was having difficulty finding a field site because at one point in time in her high school, she had some interaction with the resource officer that caused something to go on her record. Now, this is something in high school, and this had affected her ability to obtain a field site. This student was African American, and it just, how something that at a different school, as within a different color skin, would that have even been a thing? So when we talk about implications, we're not just talking about like in that moment, we're talking about someone's psychological, mental health, well-being. We're talking about their future later on, what that means. Can they obtain, a job or a field experience site? There's just so many implications for that.
Well, and what you were talking about, Dr. Dixon, I think is really important in this too, is that, it's not even historical trauma. We can't even talk about it in terms of it being historical trauma because it's still happening
right now.
Right now. So, how do you convince a kid that they are, how do you convince a kid that they are all right and that they're better than all right and that they're smart and worthy and all that when all of the structural institutional forces in your city that have power have said that you aren't, by putting a police precinct in your school? The mayor, the city council, the board of education, the police, all of these people have said that you are a specific danger and unworthy of freedom, and we're going to prove it to you by putting a police precinct in your school.
And
Man,
then
how do you fight against
furthermore,
such
Well,
when you
societal
have, when you
forces?
see that there's a, when, let's say that someone is brought to trial or something does happen, when you see someone being acquitted, when you see that there's no accountability held to those people that are committing these things, that further goes to your point that, well, this counselor is trying to, you know, build me up here and I'm trying to do these things, but everything around me seems to negate those facts.
Yeah.
Harrison, you're
But
trying to jump in there.
yeah, I mean, I can definitely see again that perspective, but I guess just on another side of the coin, if you will, with this, like one of the biggest problems, you know, schools have completely changed from the time that even all of us who are sitting here in this discussion went to school. You know, the rules of engagement have drastically changed, and now I've noticed that, you know, it is so um, geared to the I guess, for lack of a better word, like the softer side of things. There's so much more focus on, you know, the feelings or the sensitivity that needs to be addressed, and that's a great thing. But also, what happens with that is teachers are not really able to engage with the students in, say, a disciplinary action the way they could 10, 20 years ago. Okay, and those types of engagements, I mean, I've seen it my firsthand when, you know, there's an aggressive situation happening, the teacher can't do anything about it, so then, you know, the SRO comes in to try to diffuse and then remove the student to take them to the office, so on and so forth. So I mean, like, what I'm saying is to have these officers in place in schools now, I feel like is a it's also a method, because for the lack of engagement that the teachers themselves can have with these students to remove situations from their rooms or get them to in-school suspension or whatever the case may be. Now, like I said, I'm not necessarily trying to play devil's advocate by any means, but I am just saying that it's not always a detriment. You know, like even in some larger cities in school districts, I've noticed they've put an SRO, an evenly distributed amount of officers in each school, regardless of the socioeconomic buildup of that neighborhood school. So if it was an affluent school, they still had 2 officers walking around. And I'm sure they were probably doing more drug busts or whatever the case may be. But then you have them in, you know, the urbanized city schools. Same too. They were doing whatever they had to do. It was an evenly distributed amount. So it wasn't like, okay, hey, you know, poor black neighborhood, they're going to have 5 cops.
I was gonna say you went on mute.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't even know how that happened. I apologize.
That's
So
okay.
I don't even know where I got cut off at, but I could you tell me what last point you actually did get a chance to hear me say?
I think we only missed a couple words.
We only missed a couple words.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to really finish. You just like right at the very end. You know,
Okay.
let me
Yeah.
I was gonna say, let me piggyback on that a little bit, Harrison, because of, you know, I have a history in human service. I work with schools. I'm not discounting using resources in schools. I think that there are times that there is appropriateness. I think what we're talking about when you see very targeted efforts with particular populations, not so much just about all, you know, social, across the board, you have high schoolers that are, you know, struggling, and that this is a dynamic in a particular community. But there are some very targeted initiatives, and they're very specific to unique, peculiar groups of people. And so I think that's one of the things we want to talk about. And when you see that, it's like, you know, the souls of Black people, you know, what lens does that say about me? Like, what's going on there? I do think that we are experiencing some things in our culture that people are asking for additional supports because they, you know, different policies and practices are either limited, or people are struggling in particular ways, or they don't have resources. So it's a factor on both ends that we need to have some discussion about. But when you see it overdone in a particular area, it does make you want to question what is going on there. And I'm not necessarily saying that's happening locally in our community, but it is happening in places nationally throughout the United States, and it reinforces the historical experiences of those communities with the reality of what they are seeing in the moment. And I'll say this: when I was a young girl, I grew up having some exposure to my great grandmother, who was born in 1890. So she was born in Savannah, Georgia in 1890. You can imagine what's happening in our country as a result of that, and the transitions and what's going on. And I do remember, that we were very carefully instructed about how to navigate America as a Black child. We were carefully taught that the world is not going to be equal for you. You are not going to experience the world the same. And so a lot of that narrative, the healthy narrative, the positive narrative, came from home community, that despite what you might combat against, that's not the narrative you accept, even though that may be the narrative that's pushed down on you. And that's a difficult thing, particularly when we're looking at how some of our communities and our social interactions in society has shifted. And when we look at, I love that even when we talk about Black History Month, that there's this heavy focus on some of the Black institutes on Black families, because there's been a shift around those, maybe generational support structures, et cetera, that would have really reinforced those dynamics. So, when you ask that, Dr. Matthews, about how do you help somebody be okay? How do you help them navigate that? I think, it's a community, Black and Brown communities, that don't necessarily have some of those historic systemic support systems in place that maybe they used to have in the same manner, or they exist differently. And their availability to young people and families.
Well, and one of the things I think I think it's lazy. It's lazy to put cops in schools. It's absolutely lazy. It is the easiest thing for municipal governments, and school boards to say, we're going to take this money that actually could aid in the positive development of our students, and place a paramilitary force in it, put a paramilitary force in its place, right? It's also part and parcel of a larger cultural pattern that we have seen towards the militarization of police, as well as the populace, the paramilitarization of the populace. And it has seeped into our schools. Rather than, I agree with what you were saying, Mr. Dixon, about about teachers being under-resourced. But that pattern there is a chosen path by municipal governments, state governments, school boards, and to a large degree, the federal government, to take funds out of schools that would actually aid in the education in all ways, in the education of students. Because you're right, teachers are under-resourced, but they shouldn't be. Right. So, and in lieu of giving teachers and school counselors and school administrators and parents the things that they need to help their children navigate this changing world in the most healthy ways that they possibly can, in lieu of doing that, right? Because that takes multiple steps, right? There are moving parts to that. Instead of choosing the side of a healthy child populace, we've taken that money out and just stuck police in schools. It is not healthy. It is a sign of a sick society. Black, brown, and poor children have been demonized to such an extent that we have somehow justified taking away resources that are necessary for their positive development and replacing it with something that will further negative development.
Thank you, Dr. Matthews. I want to ask you a question, or ask the panel a question. When you think about those dynamics, because you kind of touched on it, what are some of the implications when we're looking at not only the racial, but the economic gaps that occur in our communities? And how does that play a role in the work or some of the dynamics that you all are talking about, or these critical conversations that need to happen? How does economics and diversity or racial inequalities dovetail? Because, we don't often talk about that side of it, except that your poor communities, poor children, but to really talk about the economic impact of that. Anybody want to take that?
I've talked a lot, so I'm gonna.
I'm thinking about when you say economic impact, are you referring to kind of where the resources are allocated, or just in general? Because I know that what I was thinking of when Dr. Matthews was talking was namely that, and I'm sorry not to entirely avoiding your question, but I do think it's related somewhat. Let's say that we all could agree that, let's say violence in schools is a problem, okay, obviously. What I kind of caught off of, and what I think of, when you're mentioning, like, it's lazy to put an officer in a school, it's easy. But let's say that we take the perspective of okay, well, let's put an officer in a school, but let's also examine what got to this point of violence, and we work backwards from there. Mm-hmm. Let's work backwards. All right, so something's going on with these students. What's going on with these students? Who could address that? Whatever we determine what's going on with these students, who are the qualified individuals who can handle that? Is that a school counselor at that point? Is that a licensed clinical social worker who works in a school? Is that a social service outside of the school that's part of the county that can assist? So it's like these different levels where intervention could potentially happen. And yes, you would need maybe an officer at some point in time, but that's not the only thing we would need. So I'm wondering if maybe part of the economic factor is that does it cost more to have that approach, that layered approach, where you're thinking, okay, well, I need the school counselor. We have X number of students. How many school counselors do we need? How many social workers might we need? What are the connections or resources that we have to make available so that we're in connections with social services beyond that, to truly address like the fundamental issues that are going on to lead to that we want to call it school violence or something that necessitates, and I put that in quotes, school resource officers or police officers. So I think that there's obviously some tie to economics within that. Economics is not necessarily my area of expertise, but I could see how on the superficial level, one would argue, well, it's easier to put officers in here versus taking the time and the resources and the power to identify those levels at which actual change can happen to prevent that other point. So I don't know if it's an economic thing that it costs more to examine it deeply. It's hard to think more, or it's hard to dissect a problem. But certainly economics is a factor in all of that. How is it not? To what degree? I'm not. Right. I wouldn't be able to articulate that.
I think that's certainly, we could spend probably a whole 2 hours like really dissecting that. I think, I wanted to just toss that out there as something for our listeners and viewers to consider and digest. But certainly we know that there is an intersection between poverty, between education, and between incarceration, right? That's the school to prison pipeline. And so we can't talk about this without really thinking about the economics behind it. And it's much bigger than, some of the points I think where you're starting to go with that, Jacqueline, because there's so many dynamics in that. I'm going to move on because because I know we don't have a lot of time, and I want to go back to maybe connecting back to the core of this social justice initiative and research project that both groups are really working on. You know, you guys, I think you mentioned, Dr. Matthews, that you're focusing on George Floyd and who was the other individual?
Michael Brown.
And Michael Brown. Yet, you know, we can go back to Eric Garner and others, right? Eric Garner was the one, he called out how many times? 11 times, I can't breathe. They did a series on that. So, you know, again, I think you mentioned earlier, this is not, you know, we know that there is historical data that supports that, you know, Black communities in particular, but certainly Black and Brown communities have endured injustice and social and racial inequalities, brutality, if you would. And even though there was this clear highlight within the past year that resurfaced the movement, or, you know, highlighted the movement, because the movement was there, it has been there. We can go back to 2014, 2012, I think it was, with Eric Gardner, who called out 11 times, I can't breathe, and was choked on the streets of New York. And somehow, though that, you know, it was put out there, it was still something that didn't grab hold to America until most recently. America is now saying, wait a minute, racism still real? And so can we talk a little bit about these projects and why we need to come back to this and still do this collection about I fear for my life? Why in 2021 are people still talking about fearing for their life? Why in 2021 do we have to have these critical conversations about race and identity and free-ish? That, you know, as Martin Luther King would say, free at last, thank God I'm free at last, but it's really free-ish at last. Why in 2021 are we still here? And when we, you know, for me, I was reflecting on, geez, I remember the Eric Garner situation. I remember reading about it, and yet we are still having those same conversations that people are saying, wait a minute, this is real. This really happens. Why do we still have this dichotomy? Why are we have to, you know, for you guys, why do you think we have to still have these projects and these dialogues?
Things haven't necessarily changed much. I guess, you know, when you look at the history of America, you know, the 60s was an era of, you know, really speaking out and just, you know, trying to fight for those civil rights. That was, you know, that era. And, you know, even when I think about it, you know, I was born just a handful of years after, you know, Martin Luther King had been assassinated. And I think about it like, well, okay, so here I am, you know, right now in 2020. So most of the people who were very deeply connected on one side of the fence or the other are still very much alive. They're, you know, not that old. And then they teach these things to their children, you know, who are maybe, say, my age, and then they've now taught them to younger generations. So it hasn't really gone anywhere. But I really want to make a very notable point that, yes, there's a problem with, say, police relations and society, but I don't think that is 100% fair, because that's, I think, almost throwing that same net when you have a bigoted person that says all Black people are this, that, or the third. Okay. You know, because not every cop is, you know, on that same wave. Okay. But it takes the individual. The individual makes the choice. You know, when we sat there and we went through all of our training and we went through all, you know, all the stuff, and say, like with George Floyd, for example, you know, as I watched that, I see it from the lens of a Black American, and I also saw it from the lens of a former law enforcement officer, you know, and I know for a fact that when we are engaging in situations, we have about a 15th of a second to make a decision. And that 15th of a second is then going to ultimately determine whether the jurors are going to look at what you did and say that was the best possible situation, or were there alternatives to your actions. And now in that case, dead wrong. There's no reason to control an individual's head or neck for that long when he is detained, and you have control of that individual. You need to move on. He made a horrible choice. He also, because he had a badge on, now represents the greater conglomerate of law enforcement, which now franchises that further stigma of all cops are like this. And it's not all, but it's every department has a problem. They need to completely go back through, figure out a stronger, I don't know, psyche val test. We all have to go through this, an MPI, whatever, CHU test or whatever. You need to do something different. People need to be evaluated, I think, almost on an annual basis. The same way, we have to get recertified for firearms or recertified in this, that, or the other. You need to get recertified in your psyche val, because definitely that job will change you. And you may not even go in as, say, like a bigoted person, but because of all the little stigmas and all the us versus them mentality that was already there, it might make you feel some type of way. But that needs to really be addressed. It's an individual case by case situation, and it's horrible that it is just spread throughout to be a blanketed statement to say all Black people or all minorities or this, that, or the third, and to say all law enforcement is this, that, and the third as well.
Yeah, I'm sure Dr. Rhonda would chime in here. I think that, this is really not, we're simply the topics is the research projects are on law enforcement and policing. Mm-hmm. But if we really had to look at it, this is a much larger societal issue that we're talking about, and power and privilege and the inequality or the division that exists based on power being associated with race and or gender or other qualities such as economic power and the lack of for certain communities. And then again, that you see this overextension in Black and Brown communities, that there's the limitations around that because of the poverty, resources, et cetera. So there are lots of dynamics, even in my own profession, we're having conversations about how might racism and discriminatory practices be embedded as a counselor or as a psychologist when you're working with someone. So it exists on multiple levels. Obviously the one that we're really looking at from the social justice perspective is that there has been loss of life, and to be done in such a manner that we have seen from the Eric Garners to the George Floyds and others raise the question about the line of power. And when you have an ultimate political figure who also makes statements or engages in behavior that go unchecked, then it reinforces for people to say, I don't feel safe. I'm in a place that I may not be able to navigate without other resources, or others are well positioned or better positioned, have advantages that I don't. And so how do we have the conversation around those so that we bring that awareness to people, and not just bring it, but how do we use it for meaningful, impactful change? I think honestly, Frederick Douglass would be looking at that. How do we move it for change? How do we bring about some attention and awareness that we can improve the system, and rather than just complaints or frustrating, but it's really about understanding it. Dr. Matthews, I see you trying to jump in there.
Well, the flaw in the argument is that nobody's born blue, right? Nobody's born carrying a gun. People who work in law enforcement have jobs, and they have jobs in which they have been not just given edicts about how they're supposed to behave, but their behaviors have been sanctioned by policy and law. And that's the difference. the sweeping statements about people in various ethnic minority groups are part and parcel of a system of social control, right? Those stereotypes and racist imagery and racist belief systems all come from the value set that has been placed before all of us by the social structure of white supremacy. And police have been an arm of white supremacy. So there is a difference between addressing the patterns of behavior of a group of people, who have jobs in which they are sanctioned to perform the quote unquote social order, and blanket kind of racist stereotypes about people because you don't want them to be able to live in the house next door to you, and that's a simplification. That last part is a simplification, oversimplification perhaps, but when you look at the pattern writ large, you see that that is precisely what has happened. But I want to get to the question that you asked about, Dr. Dixon. Why are we seeing all of this now? And I think that one of the reasons, I don't think it, I know it. George Floyd's murder was the catalyst because the whole planet watched a police officer snuff the life of a man out casually with his hands in his pockets, with people standing around pleading with him to stop, recording him for 8 minutes and 45 seconds. Who could believe that happened, right? There are large swaths of this society who have always thought of themselves as good people, right? I'm a good person. I am not racist. I am not mean. I am not nasty to people, etc. But there are whole groups of people who watch that video in utter disbelief. People told me it was happening. I didn't believe it. Because who could believe that somebody would do so? It's a police officer to serve and protect. Nobody is doing that kind of stuff. Even if you were friends with people of color and or poor people and they've told you these stories, right? You're probably like, come on now, all police officers. Come on, that's not real. And then here we saw it, right? And we all saw it. People watched it over and over again. And I think a lot of people watched it over and over and over again because they just were trying to make some sort of sense of it. There's got to be something in here that makes sense. And so now that people understand that this pattern of behavior is writ large, right? It's not just writ large in this particular moment. It's been writ large across the history of this country. And it didn't just happen to Black people. It's happened to poor white people. We've wiped out an entire nations of indigenous people. We have passed laws against people who have immigrated to this country. We had the Chinese Exclusion Act. Chinese people came here and built the friggin' railroad, right? We have all of these patterns of behavior, and because we have the internet, right, and cell phones, this pattern was revealed to millions of people, billions of people, because it happened across the planet, who had not seen it before, right? And so I think that one of the reasons we are seeing this now is because more people simply know about it now, and more people are learning about it now, and the injustice is just a bit too much for people to take, and they're rising up to attempt to make some structural change.
Thank you, Dr. Matthews. I appreciate that. I think that was one of the things that became so clear, is that we didn't just see people rising up across our communities in the United States, but we saw this global response, people chanting from London to India about Black Lives Matter. And so it really did become something that the communities across the globe became aware of and joined in, based on maybe their own experiences and their own challenges, but it became something that was very, very present. There's some chats, I'm gonna read them, and I know we're running out of time, but I do wanna get to
I wanted to offer an opinion about that. I did read the question there. But were you going to go through and read them?
Yes, I'm going to read the question from someone from the audience. It says, question from the viewer, how do we empower parents to get involved advocating for their children when they had a negative experience in school? Jacqueline, was that something you wanted to comment on?
Yeah, I know that, Harrison, you had put an answer in there, so I don't know if you want to kind of go over yours. I had my own kind of perspective, but.
Okay, sure, absolutely. Basically, I was just explaining that, you know, conscious accountability is definitely needed. You know, when our parents take involvement in our students' lives, and they're very proactive to kind of give them that guidance, because I know in certain negative situations, kids, because they're young, they don't really know how to react or respond in certain situations, and so, you know, their emotions are driven in extremities. So they may overreact or underreact to what the circumstance may actually be. So giving them that firm understanding and guidance to let them know that this is a tough situation that you have experienced, but you take this as a learning opportunity to say, this is what went wrong. So what can we do now to make sure we can ensure a different outcome? You know, what would be the best course of action for the future? Because we're all going to have those tough situations in life, yes, you know, and some are obviously tougher than others, but we have to take those negative opportunities and those moments to grow. You know, that is African Americans, that's one of the things that we've done best, exceptionally well. You know, like not one of us can say that we haven't had a negative experience in school or in a job or some other, you know, set of environments. So we can't just fly off the handle every time somebody, you know, gets us all fired up or whatever the case may be. We have to learn how to be cool, calm, and collected. We have to learn how to articulate the situation and to not repeat the mistake, but to make an attempt to correct and make a better effort so that it does not occur again.
I wanted to kind of give an answer about that, but I wanted to also give two small ideas. You had asked, why is this still happening in 2021? And my instant thought was, if you build a house at a certain angle, if every brick is infused with an ideology, if every brick is put into place with an understanding that the idea of racism, with the idea of implicit bias, then everything that how you exist in that space is naturally going to have have that be part of its existence. And so we exist in this time and space where our Capitol building, built by people who, pretty much everything about our country is infused and built with a certain understanding that there is a lesser than group of people. Let's just keep it simple like that. And so when you have people that are trying to identify how to change it, you have to first be aware of the fact that you exist in it. And because you exist in it, you're naturally part of it. And until you can kind of get yourself out of that space, you're not going to really be able to change the dialogue. The dialogues will happen, but until you see how you are part of it, in whatever shape or form that might be, it's going to keep coming up. But I like this question to totally change tracks here, but I like the idea of empowering parents and advocating. Like those two things, those are kind of my jam when I think of how I want to be as a school counselor. My first thought was, how do we empower parents? I think that we believe parents, you know, reasonably, and encourage them to find someone in the school setting that they feel is going to believe them, that they feel is going to hear them out, to trust them. And I say that because when you have that relationship between two people, a parent and someone at the school, that's going to do so much. That parent can reach out to someone and say, hey, this happened. And that person might be able to say, oh, well, here's some other factors that you should probably know about that. Or to say, okay, you know what, yeah, here's another person that you should probably talk to. And so when Harrison, you had mentioned kind of like get a gauge of like, is this a big thing, or is this like, don't just fly off the handle? But I feel like having someone at a school, even just one person, whether it's, you know, a kid that you had their teacher last year, or if it's the school counselor, or if it's someone who works in that building, that connection can hopefully empower someone to feel comfortable to express what it was that took place. But that fundamental idea of having someone you can actually go to check in with about the negative experience, who's going to believe you or at least hear you out, I feel like that's such a fundamentally good place to start, and then kind of go from there.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for joining us in our FDI series for Black History Month. I appreciate certainly always Dr. Rhonda Matthews, who comes in and is able to add such a rich understanding from a sociological and certainly a political perspective. Thank you, Harrison Dixon, who is working on the Read Me My Rights initiative for the FDI Collaborative and Research Project at EU, and certainly to Jacqueline Smith, who is a research assistant with the I Fear for My Life and working with Dr. Matthews, but is also a graduate student in the counseling program. We want to thank you again and appreciate you taking your time out to share your thoughts and your research with us. I'll ask our viewers to join us on next week, where we'll be talking about social justice pedagogy and what that means in this day and age, and why it's so important to incorporate in our instructional practices. Thank you all again for joining us, and I hope that you will come back and share with us again.